They called her Molly Pitcher. But behind the nickname was a woman whose courage shattered every expectation of her time. She was not supposed to be on the battlefield. She was not supposed to touch a weapon. And yet, when the moment came, she picked up something far heavier than a water pitcher. What she carried and what she chose to do with it would forever change how history remembered women in war. This is the story of a forgotten American hero, a woman who stood where few men dared. The year was 1776. The American colonies burned with rebellion against the greatest empire in the world. Among the thousands of soldiers and camp followers trudging through mud, hunger, and despair was a young woman named Margaret Corbin. She wasn't a soldier, not officially. Women weren't allowed to be. Her role was simple: cook meals, patch wounds, carry water to thirsty men who fought and bled under the scorching sun. The soldiers called women like her Molly Pitchers. To them, she was background noise in a war dominated by muskets and drums. But what no one realized was that Margaret's courage was waiting, buried deep, until the battle that would test her in ways no one could have imagined. November 16, 1776. The British Army launched a massive assault on Fort Washington, New York. The air was thick with gunpowder. Cannons thundered across the Hudson. Inside the fort, chaos erupted. Soldiers scrambled. Commanders shouted orders lost in the roar of war. Margaret stood beside her husband, John Corbin, a soldier assigned to one of the fort's cannons. She carried water, tended to the wounded, and watched as British troops swarmed closer, their red coats flashing like fire in the smoke. But then disaster struck. A musket ball tore through John's chest. He collapsed at the cannon's wheel, lifeless. For a moment, time froze. The cannons sat unmanned. The enemy advanced. Soldiers hesitated, their line breaking. And then Margaret stepped forward. Her hands shook as she gripped the cannon's ramrod. This wasn't her place. She knew it. Everyone knew it. But she also knew something else. If that cannon fell silent, the enemy would pour through. Margaret took her husband's position. Shot after shot, she loaded, rammed, fired. Her body jolted with every blast. Smoke burned her eyes. The recoil bruised her shoulders. Men stared in disbelief. Some laughed at first. Others shouted at her to stop. But when the cannon roared under her command, cutting down the British advance, the laughter died. Margaret Corbin wasn't a nurse anymore. She was a soldier. Hours dragged on. The enemy pressed harder. Margaret's arms ached, her clothes stained with sweat and blood. Then agony. Shrapnel ripped into her shoulder, chest, and jaw. Most would have collapsed. But Margaret refused to leave her post. Wounded, bleeding, barely standing, she loaded, rammed, and fired. Witnesses later swore she fought until the very last shot, until her body could bear no more. And when she finally fell, it was not out of surrender, but exhaustion. The British captured the fort that day, but they could not capture Margaret's spirit. Margaret never fully recovered from her wounds. She lived the rest of her life scarred, crippled, and in pain. But she did something no woman had ever done before. In America's fight for freedom. In recognition of her bravery, the government granted her a lifetime pension, the first military pension ever awarded to a woman in the United States. Her story, though, slipped into shadows, buried in dusty records, reduced to a nickname, Molly Pitcher. But Margaret Corbin was far more than that. She was proof that courage has no gender, proof that in the darkest hours, heroes can rise from the most unexpected places. Margaret Corbin's name may not echo as loudly as Washington's or Lafayette's, but on that November day, when her husband fell and fear threatened to silence the guns, she stood tall. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of her story is not her wounds or her struggles afterward, but how easily history forgets women like her. So remember her. Remember the nurse who became a soldier, the widow who became a warrior, the ordinary woman who, for one brief, unforgettable moment, carried the weight of a nation's freedom on her shoulders. Because Margaret Corbin was not just Molly Pitcher, she was a soldier of the Revolution, and her courage still thunders across time.